They built 98 homes on my land thinking I'd do nothing, until my legal trap turned their dream into a nightmare. Marcus Thompson returned to his family ranch after a business trip, only to find tractors, construction crews, and nearly 100 houses rising on his property. Heart-pounding, he realized the HOA had ignored every boundary and zoning law to expand their development. The air smelled of fresh asphalt and freshly cut wood, but the thrill of rage burned hotter. Marcus had prepared for this moment for weeks. He had every document meticulously organized: land deeds, property surveys, correspondence, photos of the unauthorized pipeline, and recordings of HOA communications. Every email Karen Whitmore had sent instructing construction crews to dig across his property, every invoice signed without consent, and every flimsy justification for her so-called community improvements was at his fingertips. He carried the folder into the HOA boardroom like a soldier entering enemy territory. The room smelled faintly of stale coffee, polished wood, and an underlying note of tension so thick it clung to the walls. Board members were already seated, glancing nervously at one another. Some fidgeted with pens, others tapped fingers against the polished tabletop. It was clear they had sensed the storm arriving before Marcus even opened the door. But Karen Whitmore, the queen of chaos herself, sat at the head of the table, perfectly composed. Her posture was impeccable, her smirk precise, her nails clicking softly against the tabletop. The kind of smirk that suggested she had orchestrated chaos before breakfast and intended to do it again before lunch. Marcus cleared his throat, feeling the adrenaline surge in his veins. He unfolded the first sheet of evidence, sliding it across the table toward the board. "I need answers," he said, voice firm, controlled. "This trench, dug across my property, and the pipeline installed without consent, explain how this is legal." Karen leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs with calculated elegance. "Legal?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "Marcus, the HOA voted on this project. The majority decided the pipeline was necessary. It's for the good of the neighborhood." Marcus shook his head, a thin smile of disbelief forming on his lips. "For the good of the neighborhood, on my private property, without my consent, without permits, without proper inspection." He tapped a series of documents across the table, each one a nail in the coffin of her justification. "These are all official land records, all showing unequivocally that this land belongs to me, and yet your crew dug across it, installed pipes, and threatened my property without authorization." Karen's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, Marcus, surely you understand. Sometimes leadership requires decisive action. We can't wait for everyone to agree. Progress doesn't happen without initiative." Marcus's eyes narrowed. This was more than incompetence. It was deliberate, audacious, and reckless. "Initiative? This isn't initiative. This is trespass, and it's illegal." He let his words hang in the air like a blade. "If you reviewed the property boundaries, you'd have seen there's no legal way for this pipeline to cross my land without express permission. You knew that, and yet you proceeded anyway." The board shifted uncomfortably. A few members glanced at each other, silently debating whether to intervene or remain silent. Karen, sensing their hesitation, straightened her posture, her voice dripping with condescension. "Marcus, you're overreacting. You've always been so reactive. This is for the greater good. Do you really want to be the man who stands in the way of progress?" Marcus took a deep breath, forcing calm over the simmering anger that threatened to boil over. He spread photographs across the table, images of the trench cutting through his pasture, dirt mounds scattered carelessly, and the pipeline partially installed. "Progress," he repeated, each syllable deliberate. "Tell me, Karen, is this progress? The cows that were terrified and scattered, the fence posts destroyed, the damage to my property. Is that progress?" Karen's face flushed, a shade deeper than her usual calculated pink. "That's unfortunate collateral, but it was necessary," she said, voice tight but trying to maintain authority. Marcus leaned forward, locking eyes with her. "Collateral? You think damaging private property and bypassing legal boundaries is collateral? This isn't a minor oversight. This is a calculated violation of my rights. And make no mistake, this isn't just negligence. This is blatant, illegal trespass. You knew exactly what you were doing. The room went quiet. Even Karen's loyal board members were squirming in their chairs. One of them, a middle-aged woman with a sharp bob haircut, whispered under her breath, "He's right. This isn't just a mistake." Marcus didn't let the opportunity pass. He pulled out a copy of the property deed, laying it flat on the polished table. The signature lines gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "This is the legal boundary," he said, sliding it toward the board. "Every inch beyond this line belongs to me, yet your pipeline crosses it by at least 50 feet. You've dug into private land without permits, without authorization. This isn't about HOA governance. It's about you ignoring the law." Karen's smirk returned, sharper this time, as if she were ready to slice through his argument with a single word. "Marcus, the board supports me. We voted on this project. Democracy favors the majority, not the individual. You'll have to accept that your personal objections don't outweigh the needs of the community." Marcus's hands clenched into fists on the tabletop. He realized that this wasn't just arrogance. This wasn't incompetence or miscommunication. This was strategic, a bold attempt to override property law with authority. Karen wasn't just breaking rules. She was testing whether power and intimidation could replace legality. He exhaled slowly, channeling his frustration into clarity. "Karen, let me make this very clear," he said, voice steady, cold, and resolute. "This isn't about majority opinion. This isn't about your self-proclaimed duty to the HOA. This is about law. You have trespassed. You have endangered property. You have proceeded without consent or legal authority, and I am not going to let it stand. I have documents, witnesses, and evidence, and if necessary, this will be resolved in court. You do not have the right to trample my property under the guise of HOA leadership. Not now. Not ever." Karen's eyes flickered with something Marcus hadn't seen before, a brief moment of panic, a crack in her armor. But she quickly masked it with a forced smile, leaning back in her chair with a confidence that now seemed brittle. "Marcus, calm down. We can resolve this amicably. Surely there's a compromise we can reach." Marcus shook his head. "No compromise. You've had every opportunity to do the right thing. You chose this path deliberately. I didn't come here to negotiate your arrogance. I came here to confront illegal action. And now, Karen, you will face the consequences of your own choices." The room felt electric. Tension crackled in the air like static. Every board member was watching, some wide-eyed, some quietly relieved that Marcus had taken a firm stand. Karen's smirk wavered once more, her fingers drumming nervously on the table. The arrogance she had relied upon for years was now met with unyielding resolve. Marcus gathered his documents, straightened his jacket, and took one last deliberate glance at Karen. "This isn't personal," he said quietly. "It's about the law, and the law doesn't favor arrogance, smirks, or unchecked authority. It favors facts, evidence, and rights. I suggest you remember that." With that, he turned, leaving the boardroom with the quiet confidence of someone who had just planted the first seeds of accountability. The echo of his footsteps followed him down the hall, a reminder to everyone that authority, no matter how arrogant, could not erase the truth. And in that moment, Marcus realized something profound. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was the beginning of reclaiming control, protecting what was rightfully his, and exposing the truth behind a reign of HOA chaos that had gone unchecked for far too long. Karen Whitmore, for all her bravado and smirks, had just met someone who wouldn't be intimidated. And that was only the beginning. The stack of paperwork on Marcus's dining table had grown into a miniature mountain. Deeds, maps, surveyor notes, zoning records, hand-drawn plats from the 1970s, and dusty legal documents he'd inherited but never imagined he'd need. Nights blended into each other as he sat surrounded by documents, lamp casting long shadows over the table, the smell of old paper and black coffee filling the room. Most people avoided legal paperwork like a plague. Marcus dove in like a man sharpening weapons before a war. He knew one thing with certainty. Corinne's arrogance wasn't random, it was calculated. She wouldn't have dug a pipeline through his land unless she believed she had some kind of legal leverage. HOA presidents addicted to control didn't gamble blindly. They gambled when they thought everyone else was too ignorant to stop them. So he did the one thing Corinne never expected. He started reading every document she assumed no one would ever check. The first night, nothing explosive emerged, just boundary descriptions, old homeowner signatures, and the usual HOA nonsense about paint colors and lawn height. But by the second night, Marcus's eyes landed on something far more interesting. An old plat map showing the original layout of the land before the HOA existed. His ranch wasn't just a large parcel, it was the original parcel, the land everything else had been carved out from. Which meant something Corinne absolutely didn't want him to realize. His property easements existed before the HOA. And pre-existing easements overrode every modern HOA bylaw. Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the page as the realization settled in. If the HOA wanted to run any utilities, even community projects, they needed either his signature or an eminent domain case, and the HOA had no authority to declare eminent domain. None whatsoever. He whispered to himself, "So you built your little pipeline on land you never legally controlled." He flipped through more pages. And then he found the real gem. Buried in a folder labeled Mineral Rights Transfer, something most homeowners never even opened, was a clause granting him exclusive rights to underground resources across his acreage and any land dependent on his watershed. That meant the water running under his ranch, and any pipeline touching it, could be regulated by him, not the HOA. He almost laughed. Corinne had accidentally trespassed into territory she legally could never own. By the third night, he wasn't just reading, he was strategizing. Papers were arranged like a battle map, markers identifying leverage points, loopholes, and clauses Corinne had no idea existed. The deeper he dug, the more control he realized he had. One line from a 1984 document hit him like a thunderbolt. No structure relying upon subsurface water supply shall be deemed habitable unless the source is verified non-encroaching on Parcel A. Parcel A, his ranch, his water. He rose slowly, packing the room as a grin spread across his face. If Corinne wanted to play games, Marcus could make the entire neighborhood uninhabitable, legally, until the pipeline, permits, compensation, and land restoration were resolved. He wouldn't even need a lawyer to argue it. The law was already written, waiting like a dormant trap Corinne had blindly stepped into. All he had to do was pull the lever. He spent the next few nights drafting letters, not threatening ones, official ones, quiet ones, the kind that didn't make noise but moved silently through bureaucratic pipelines, triggering inspections and reviews. He contacted environmental agencies, water quality boards, utility regulators, Department of Natural Resources, even the county's Land Survey Division. The more paperwork he sent out, the clearer the path became. If he initiated a review of the pipeline's legality under the old mineral and water rights clauses, the county would be forced to freeze all new home approvals until the issue was resolved. No permits, no occupancy, no new families moving in, no HOA expansion. He could legally shut the entire HOA down without ever stepping foot in their meetings again. Corinne wasn't the only one who knew how to use rules. Marcus worked quietly, like a surgeon preparing for precise cuts. He collected signatures, notarized documents, scanned old plats into digital format, and even had a retired surveyor come out to re-verify the property markers. Every inch of the ranch was documented, time-stamped, photographed, and certified. There would be no loophole for Corinne to squeeze through. By midnight on the fifth night, Marcus sat at the table with a stack of letters ready to mail. Each one was a legal grenade. The moment they went out, the HOA's foundation would start shaking. He tapped the stack gently, thinking about what came next. He wasn't doing this out of vengeance, though he couldn't deny a small, satisfying spark every time he imagined Corinne reading the first official inquiry letter. He was doing it because she'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, literally dug across his land, ignored boundaries, bullied homeowners, and assumed her title made her untouchable. Titles meant nothing to land. Property respected only the law. And the law was on his side. But Marcus wasn't reckless. He knew an attack this large needed precision. He needed a plan the HOA couldn't spin, couldn't fight, and couldn't counter without exposing their own violations. So he crafted his strategy in phases. Phase 1. Trigger property and environmental inspections. Phase 2. Freeze HOA projects dependent on water use. Phase 3. Force disclosure of the pipeline plans. Phase 4. Demand compensation for trespass, damage, and illegal construction. Phase 5. If the HOA resisted, initiate a full legal injunction. He wasn't the kind of man who liked conflict, but he was the kind who finished what others started. And Corinne had started something big. As Dion approached, Marcus walked outside, cool air brushing his face. The ranch stretched silently beneath a pale orange horizon. Birds were beginning to stir, cattle moving lazily near the fence line, right beside the unauthorized pipeline trench Corinne had ordered. He stared at it, jaw tightening. "You wanted a war," he murmured softly. "You picked the wrong property." With the paperwork ready and the law behind him, Marcus knew one thing with absolute certainty. If the HOA wanted to play fast and loose, he could make every home they built temporarily uninhabitable. And he wouldn't have to break a single rule to do it. This wasn't revenge. This was justice, served through loopholes Corinne never dreamed existed. And he was just getting started. Corinne Whitmore was a master of arrogance. She had ignored Marcus's warnings, his carefully documented evidence, and the meticulous legal research he had spent nights compiling. In her mind, authority was everything. Rules were suggestions. Boundaries existed only to be tested. The pipeline, the trenches, the unauthorized encroachments, they were all minor details to her. Progress, she insisted, demanded bold action, even if that meant trampling over the rights of a property owner who knew the law better than anyone else. The morning sun filtered through the blinds as Marcus sat at his kitchen table, reviewing the latest emails from the HOA. Contractors were reporting delays, minor setbacks, and strange inquiries from inspectors. But Corinne's board had chosen to continue construction anyway. They believed momentum would carry them through. They believed authority would protect them. Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting the hum of the refrigerator fill the room as he considered his options. Patience was part of the plan, and so was precision. Corinne was about to learn the difference between perceived power and actual power. He opened his laptop and began drafting emergency legal injunctions. Each document was carefully structured, citing property deeds, easement rights, zoning laws, and mineral ownership. Every clause, every citation, every paragraph was designed to be irrefutable. There could be no argument, no loophole to exploit, no wiggle room for Corinne's bold moves. By mid-morning, Marcus had submitted injunctions to multiple authorities: the county clerk, the local building inspector, and the state's Environmental Oversight Committee. Copies were simultaneously sent via certified mail to the HOA, the contractors, and legal counsel. Every email, every fax, and every delivery receipt was tracked meticulously, ensuring a paper trail that would be impossible to dispute. The construction site was chaos in slow motion. Corinne's crew had begun laying the next segment of the pipeline, shovels biting into dirt, pipes lined up for installation. They worked methodically, unaware, or perhaps dismissive of the storm brewing just a few blocks away. Contractors exchanged nervous glances as phones buzzed repeatedly. Inspectors' notes arrived, citations were filed, and emails pinged with urgent subject lines. Stop work order, emergency injunction filed, legal violation, immediate halt required. At first, the workers hesitated, thinking it was a bureaucratic prank, a mistake, or perhaps a delay that could be negotiated later. Karen marched between them, clipboard in hand, barking orders, her voice slicing through the air like a whip. Keep going, don't stop. We're improving the community. But then the legal notices began arriving physically at the site. Inspectors appeared, papers in hand, badges gleaming under the sun. They read aloud the injunctions, quoting the exact clauses, citing Marcus's documented evidence. This construction violates private property rights, one inspector said sternly. Under the law, all work must cease immediately. Any further action will be considered trespass and subject to prosecution. The crew froze, shovels hung suspended midair. One of the younger laborers, wide-eyed, muttered, "Wait, so we can't touch it." Karen's face turned red, veins visible at her temples. She snapped her fingers at the contractors. "Ignore them, they don't understand the project. We have authority. The majority supports this. Continue." Marcus, sitting back in his chair across town, felt a quiet smile form. Karen didn't understand a critical distinction. Authority doesn't override the law. Not when evidence, documentation, and legal precedent all aligned against her. As the morning wore on, inspectors reinforced the orders. Stop work notices were posted at every entrance. Legal letters were personally delivered to the HOA office. Even the local sheriff's office received copies. The contractors, previously loyal to Karen's orders, had no choice but to obey. Continuing work now would constitute illegal activity, opening themselves, and the HOA to fines, lawsuits, and potential criminal liability. The whispers started. Board members spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously at Karen. Some of the younger assistants muttered, maybe Marcus was serious. Others went pale at the thought of liability. For the first time, Karen's smirk faltered. Her carefully constructed aura of control was cracking. Karen tried to rally them. "This is temporary, just temporary," she shouted. "We can file appeals. We can negotiate. Don't let one person stop progress." But the inspectors, backed by legal documentation and court orders, were unmoved. They were professionals, trained to enforce the law. Even Karen's intimidation tactics, pointed fingers, raised voices, dramatic gestures, were powerless against statutory authority. Marcus had anticipated this. He had not only frozen building permits, but also notified the county that any work carried out while injunctions were active would nullify existing approvals and void liability insurance for the HOA. In other words, continue construction, and any damages, accidents, or failures were the HOA's responsibility alone. The contractors realized this immediately. Safety and liability now demanded compliance. By mid-afternoon, the worksite resembled a ghost town. Tools were stacked neatly, shovels abandoned in partially dug trenches, and pipes lined up but untouched. Karen wandered between her crew like a trapped animal packing in a cage. Her clipboard, once a symbol of control, now felt heavy in her hands. She barked orders that went ignored, tried to issue threats that were now meaningless, and attempted to justify the construction. But each word fell flat against the wall of legal authority Marcus had built. Meanwhile, Marcus reviewed the digital confirmations of injunction service. Every letter read, every email received, every phone call logged. The law had taken effect even before a single additional foot of trench was dug. His calm demeanor hid the satisfaction swelling within him. Karen had played the game as if the rules didn't matter, and now those rules had caught her in their snare. By sunset, the site was fully cleared, construction halted indefinitely. Contractors had returned to the office, muttering about paperwork, liability, and the unexpected legal explosion. Board members followed reluctantly, leaving Karen standing alone amid the silent trenches, a ruler whose power had been neutralized by the one thing she never respected: law and documentation. Marcus leaned back in his chair at home, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The trenches cut across his property like scars on the land, but they would heal. Corinne's hubris, on the other hand, had left a far more permanent mark, proof that arrogance could be dismantled, systematically, one legal clause at a time. The HOA's blind move had backfired spectacularly, and Marcus, calm and meticulous, knew the next steps would follow naturally. Corinne had pushed too far, ignored the law, and underestimated the man who had spent weeks digging through every loophole, every clause, and every document. For once, progress wouldn't proceed on Corinne's terms. It would proceed on the law's terms, and Marcus was holding all the cards. Marcus spent the night crafting his final moves with surgical precision. The HOA had made their error. Arrogance had replaced logic, and assumptions had replaced due diligence. Corinne Whitmore believed her position, her charm, and her carefully cultivated air of authority could override property rights, zoning laws, and the very statutes that governed the land. She had never faced someone who would treat law and documentation as weapons. Now she would. By first light, Marcus was at his desk, laptop open, legal folders stacked neatly around him. Every clause, every precedent, every covenant governing the community and its construction had been meticulously catalogued. He had combed through the original founding documents of the neighborhood association, reviewing the language of each covenant, easement, and restriction. There were 98 homes in the development, each bound by the same rules. Buried deep in the original covenants were protections Marcus had discovered almost by accident. Clauses specifying that no home could be occupied until all construction, water supply, insurance, and municipal approvals were verified and documented. The implications hit him like a hammer. If he executed this correctly, Corinne's entire neighborhood would effectively be grounded, legally frozen, until every violation she had caused was corrected, every permission granted, and every liability addressed. The HOA would have no choice but to comply, and every day of delay would be a constant reminder of the overreach they had attempted. Marcus drafted letters, each carefully worded to leave no ambiguity. Notices to the HOA, the municipal authorities, the county building department, the insurance companies, and even the homeowners' individual files. Each notice cited the exact clause that mandated compliance before occupancy, included scanned copies of deeds, plats, and easement maps, and outlined the legal consequences of noncompliance. By 9 a.m., the first notices were served. Marcus had arranged for certified mail, electronic notifications, and in-person delivery to ensure that the information was undeniable, irrevocable, and legally binding. Every recipient received the same clear message. Until compliance with all original community covenants and legal obligations is verified, occupancy of these homes is prohibited. Any attempt to ignore this order is considered a violation of municipal and state law. At the HOA office, the effect was instantaneous. Corinne Whitmore arrived, radiant in her usual confidence, clipboard in hand, expecting to stride into the day like a queen presiding over her kingdom. She had no idea the kingdom had quietly slipped out from under her. The first letter arrived in her inbox. She opened it casually, scanning the summary, and then froze. Her eyes widened as she realized the full weight of the message. Another email pinged, followed by a third, all from different authorities citing different statutes but all pointing to the same outcome. The homes could not be inhabited until compliance was verified. Corinne's smug smile faltered. She had anticipated resistance from Marcus. Heck, she had expected him to argue, but she had not anticipated the scale, precision, or immediacy of the legal counterstrike. She scanned the attached documents and her composure began to crumble. Every clause she had ignored, every permit she had assumed unnecessary, every oversight she had treated as trivial was now cited with evidence, time-stamped and validated. Her assistants hovered nervously behind her desk, whispers growing urgent. "What does this mean?" one asked. Are people allowed to live there? Karen's usual composure cracked into a thin veneer of panic. It's temporary, just a procedural delay. It's fine, she stammered, tapping the papers with trembling fingers. But deep down, she knew. She had walked straight into a trap. Word spread quickly to the homeowners. Texts, calls, and emails erupted as residents discovered that the occupancy of their homes was now legally suspended. Many were confused, some angry, but Marcus had anticipated that reaction. Public panic would force accountability faster than any private meeting ever could. He had sent concise explanations to homeowners, citing legal clauses without alarmism, ensuring that while they were aware, they understood that the resolution lay with the HOA. Karen's phone buzzed incessantly. Every call from a resident, every frantic email, every question about inspections, water supply, and occupancy now landed on her desk. The board was scrambling. Contracts needed review, insurance certificates needed verification, and municipal approvals had to be rechecked, all of which Karen had ignored in her rush to assert authority. Marcus watched it unfold quietly. He didn't need to intervene further. The trap had sprung. Karen's overreach, her arrogance, and her willful ignorance were now doing the work for him. By late afternoon, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting. Karen tried to speak, to rally them, to insist that Marcus was overreacting, but no one listened. She pointed at her clipboard, at her carefully annotated plans, at her well-intentioned but disastrous decisions, but the documents Marcus had provided to the authorities were irrefutable. The board realized the extent of the violation. Their actions, sanctioned by Karen, had not only been unauthorized but illegal, leaving them personally liable for fines, penalties, and compliance costs. Karen's words grew frantic. "We can fix this. We can file for variance. We can." A senior board member cut her off. "Karen, you ignored property law, easement rights, and municipal requirements. This isn't a request. Occupancy is suspended. The county inspector is coming tomorrow, and until every step is compliant, nothing moves forward." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's smirk, once a symbol of unshakable confidence, was gone. She looked around the room, realizing she had lost control completely. Marcus had anticipated this, calculated every response, and left nothing to chance. Her bluff had been called, and she had no recourse. That evening, Marcus returned home to the quiet of his ranch. He walked through the pastures, the sun setting over golden hills, a sense of satisfaction swelling in his chest. The trenches on his land were undisturbed, the pipeline halted, and the HOA's expansion frozen. The law, wielded with precision and foresight, had restored balance. Karen had walked straight into his trap. Her overreach, her hubris, and her failure to respect property and procedure had allowed Marcus to turn her own authority against her. For the first time, the neighborhood was aligned with reality, not ego, and every homeowner would now see clearly who had protected their rights and who had nearly destroyed them with arrogance. Marcus paused, watching the last rays of sunlight glint off the creek that ran through his property. The ranch was peaceful, the legal machinery engaged, and Karen's reign of chaos finally checked. He took a deep breath, knowing that while battles might continue, the first decisive victory had been won. The HOA had been blind, Marcus had not, and now the law was his ally. By the following morning, the neighborhood had erupted into chaos. Word of the injunctions and the legal freeze on occupancy spread faster than wildfire. Texts pinged relentlessly, emails piled up, and phone calls rang off the hook. Homeowners, many who had previously dismissed Karen Whitmore's antics as harmless bureaucracy, were now confronted with a frightening reality. Their newly built homes, some already partially occupied, could not legally be lived in. Marcus watched the digital storm unfold from the quiet sanctuary of his ranch. Across his screens, he saw homeowners' faces pale as they absorbed the implications. Social media threads began buzzing with panic. Why can't we move in? Who's responsible for this? Is the HOA breaking the law? Posts and comments amplified fears and frustrations, but Marcus remained calm. Every action, every notification, every document he had filed was airtight. Every loophole Karen had ignored now worked entirely in his favor. At the HOA office, the scene was the opposite of calm. Karen Whitmore, once brimming with confidence, was now a flurry of frantic energy. Her hair slightly disheveled, blouse wrinkled from packing, sunglasses perched precariously atop her head, she barked orders to her assistant. "Call the builders, tell them to stop. Explain. No, don't explain, just fix it." The assistant, barely able to keep up, responded nervously, "Karen, the injunctions are legal. The inspectors." "Legal?" Karen shouted, slamming her hand against her desk. "Legal doesn't matter. We can appeal. We can negotiate, we can." But every appeal and negotiation required compliance first. Every attempt to override Marcus's actions was tied up in the very legal framework he had weaponized. He had anticipated every one of her desperate moves, leaving her scrambling for leverage she didn't have. Meanwhile, contractors halted all work. Piles of lumber, piping, and construction materials sat idle in yards and driveways, waiting for permits and authorizations that would not arrive until compliance was verified. Workers shook their heads in disbelief. "We've never had a stop like this before," one foreman muttered to another. It's all legal. The homeowner's rights trump everything. Can't touch a thing." Insurance companies stepped in next. Policies had clauses tied to lawful construction, occupancy, and verified compliance. Marcus had sent copies of the injunctions and documentation to every relevant provider. Overnight, claims departments reviewed the records, flagged risk assessments, and froze coverage. Without insurance confirmation, any attempt to resume construction or allow occupancy would nullify liability coverage. A simple mistake could now cost the HOA millions. Karen's panic only deepened. She paced from office to office, frantically calling attorneys, insurance adjusters, and city inspectors. Every call ended with the same grim response. The law was clear, the documents binding, and Marcus's actions unassailable. For the first time, Karen understood the scale of her miscalculation. Board members gathered in a hastily called emergency meeting. Karen, desperate to maintain authority, attempted to lead the session with her usual theatrics, pointing at charts, waving her clipboard, and invoking bylaws she believed gave her control. But the board, now aware of the legal ramifications, was hesitant. Their allegiance wavered. Every lawyerly citation Marcus had submitted, every clause referencing easements, permits, and mineral rights, now hung over the room like an unavoidable storm cloud. One senior board member, normally Karen's strongest ally, cleared his throat. "Karen, the documents are clear. We cannot authorize construction or occupancy until all compliance is verified. Marcus's position is correct. If we proceed otherwise, we're liable." Karen's jaw tightened, and her voice rose, but even her volume couldn't drown out the weight of law pressing down. She glanced around the table, realizing that many of her loyal supporters were quietly agreeing with Marcus's points, or at least unwilling to risk exposure. For the first time, she had lost control, not just over the construction, but over the very people who had once followed her every directive. By afternoon, concessions began rolling in. Karen was forced to negotiate, not with Marcus as a peer, but with Marcus as the arbiter of authority. Builders, HOA staff, and legal representatives converged to confirm procedures, verify documentation, and secure approvals. She had no leverage. Every step Marcus had taken left her scrambling, forced to react rather than act. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Watching Karen's frantic attempts to regain control, seeing her authority evaporate under the pressure of compliance and law, was enough. He had set the trap, and it had worked perfectly. She had built the pipeline, ignored boundaries, and thought her position shielded her. Now, her position had become the instrument of her own undoing. Across the neighborhood, residents began calling Marcus directly, asking for clarification and guidance. They were grateful, relieved, and, in some cases, incredulous. Many admitted that Karen's tyranny had been quietly tolerated for too long, and Marcus's intervention had restored not just legality but sanity. By early evening, the HOA office resembled a war room in retreat. Karen sat at her desk, surrounded by halted construction contracts, pending insurance claims, and a growing pile of official notices. Her clipboard, once a symbol of authority, now seemed like a relic. The staff moved cautiously, aware that Marcus's legal maneuvers had shifted the balance of power irreversibly. Karen's phone buzzed incessantly. Residents, attorneys, inspectors, and board members calling simultaneously. She tried to maintain composure, but every ring reminded her that she had underestimated Marcus, ignored the law, and assumed unchecked authority would suffice. Marcus, back at his ranch, watched the sun dip below the horizon. He walked along the fence line, the creek glittering gold in the evening light. The land was calm, his property untouched, and the chaos he had engineered legally was spreading through the HOA like wildfire. The lesson was clear. Arrogance could be dismantled systematically. Precision could replace bluster, and the law, when wielded intelligently, was an unstoppable force. And Karen Whitmore, for all her bravado, had finally realized that a single property owner, armed with evidence, patience, and strategy, could bring an entire HOA to its knees. Weeks passed in a blur of legal motions, certified letters, and carefully documented inspections. Marcus moved with quiet precision, each step calculated, each document submitted, every notification verified. While Karen Whitmore and her beleaguered board scrambled to react, Marcus maintained a calm dominance, the kind only someone who truly understood both the law and strategy could project. From the outset, he had one goal: restore control and peace to his property, while ensuring the HOA could never again overstep its bounds. The settlement negotiations began with Karen reluctantly seated across from him in the county's small mediation room. Her usual smirk was gone, replaced by a tense, forced expression. Every argument she tried to make was met with Marcus calmly citing legal clauses, evidence of trespass, easement violations, and past infractions. According to Section 14B of the original covenant, all structures dependent on my land's resources require verified approval, Marcus said quietly, tapping his folder. Any further construction without my written consent will be considered unlawful. That includes water access, pipelines, or easements on my property. Karen attempted to argue that she had acted in the community's best interest. We were just trying to ensure proper water flow. It's for everyone, she said, voice rising with frustration. Marcus leaned back, letting the tension fill the room. You acted illegally. You trespassed. You ignored established property rights. Good intentions do not override the law. You've seen firsthand the consequences. Her board members exchanged nervous glances. They had seen contracts frozen, insurance reviews halted, and homeowners panicked. Karen was no longer leading. They were following the inevitable outcome Marcus had engineered. Over the next few days, detailed inspections were conducted. Improperly constructed homes were identified. Some needed new permits, others had to be partially or fully removed. Builders were forced to comply with stringent legal guidelines, and insurance companies, now fully briefed on the violations, demanded formal oversight before coverage could continue. Marcus had anticipated every point of resistance. Each inspection report, each official notice, and every legal citation he submitted reinforced his authority. Even Karen's attempts to appeal or circumvent the rulings were rebuffed by courts and inspectors alike. The turning point came during a formal HOA meeting called to address the settlement. Karen attempted to reassert control, pointing at blueprints and budget reports, insisting the residents would face undue delays and costs. A homeowner previously loyal to Karen stood up. "We're paying for your mistakes," he said, shaking his head. We trusted you, and now Marcus has ensured our homes are safe and legal. It's time to comply." Corinne's voice faltered. She tried to speak again, but the room was no longer listening. Marcus had turned the tide. Her authority was gone, her arrogance exposed, and her reputation irreversibly damaged. By the end of the meeting, the settlement was formalized. All improperly built homes were either retrofitted to comply with proper permits or dismantled. Marcus gained formal oversight of any future HOA expansions impacting his property, ensuring that no unilateral decisions could bypass his consent again. Back at his ranch, Marcus finally allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He walked through the pastures, the creek glimmering under the afternoon sun, cattle grazing peacefully, and the once-drenched land fully restored. The chaos had ended. The pipelines had been removed or rerouted legally, every boundary and easement now respected. The ranch, his sanctuary, was whole again. Marcus felt a rare stillness, a deep sense of justice fulfilled. Weeks of meticulous planning, patient legal maneuvering, and strategic foresight had culminated in a victory that was complete, undeniable, and lasting. Corinne and her board, humiliated and chastened, were forced to comply with every aspect of the settlement. The arrogant HOA president who once imagined herself untouchable had learned the hard way that power without law was meaningless. Every memo, inspection, and signed document now bore Marcus's imprimatur, ensuring that the neighborhood could function safely, but under rules he controlled whenever his property was involved. As Marcus sipped cold water on his porch, watching the golden sun dip behind the distant hills, he reflected on the journey. It hadn't been about vengeance. It had been about justice, property rights, and ensuring that no one could trample over him or the land again. He felt a rare, profound satisfaction. Peace had returned, control had been restored, and the ranch was truly his domain once more. The land was quiet. The threats were gone. The HOA had been humbled. And Marcus, calm and unshakable, knew that from now on he would always have the final word on what happened on his property. Victory, he realized, was best measured not in noise, confrontation, or revenge, but in quiet control, unwavering law, and the serene knowledge that he had protected what was his, once and for all.